Tony Brar here for Oilers TV as we continue to tee up the 2020 NHL Draft, which begins on Tuesday, October 6th, as I'm pleased to welcome the draft guru, Sam Cosentino from Sportsnet. Sam, I know that's not your official title over at Sportsnet, but that's certainly the name we have for you here around at Oilers TV. Thanks so much for doing this.
Well, you're too kind, and we've been lucky enough to work together the last few years, so that's been nice. We didn't have that opportunity this year, so I guess this is the way we do it virtually here in 2020.
That's right. Like you said, I know it's not our usual spot in meeting up at the Combine, but there really hasn't been anything that's been usual about 2020 as a whole. We talked to Oilers Director of Scouting, Tyler Wright, a few weeks ago and again on Friday, and he's mentioned how his group has needed to get creative in assessing this year's talent. Just wondering for you, how have things changed for you this year and your work leading up to the draft?
Yeah, well, quite a bit. I mean, typically you get some opportunities to be able to see players in different situations, and that didn't really happen. I mean, for me, kind of the most important thing based on this year's draft class in particular was CHL playoffs, because there's a lot of CHL content, I believe, in the first round of the draft. So you want to see people in high leverage situations. Memorial Cup, obviously, I mean, everyone knows what it's like to miss 2 weeks in Kelowna. That really sucks. But I mean, in terms of the competition and the players that would have been there, and then probably the real killer was the under 18s that were going to be played in Plymouth. So I had it all set up where I was going to be able to get in there for 4 or 5 days, approved by the bosses. Budget wise, it was a home run because it was about a 5-hour drive here from the house. So missing out on that opportunity really hurt. And no different for guys like Tyler Wright and all the NHL head scouts, across the league. So you have to lean on video more. You probably have to embrace the analytics side of it a little more, which is tough for the old school to do. But having said that, you're probably getting a lot more individual time with the players on the Zoom calls, and you're probably getting a lot more time to meet with your group. Obviously you are, because the draft has been pushed back a few months. So it probably has made for some really good conversation amongst teams, where now you're tasked in video to watch players that maybe aren't necessarily in your area, but now you probably have a much wider breadth of information on the entire draft class as opposed to just those in your area.
Of course, unique circumstances all throughout 2020. But Sam, of course, the Oilers are holders of the 14th overall selection. But there seem to be a couple of wild cards in the top half of the first round, particularly with some defensemen and a certain goaltender.
Yeah, no question. I think Yaroslav Askarov, when I put my mock draft out tomorrow, I will have him going to Edmonton. I mean, I look at Ken Holland's history with Russian players and think that that's a situation that not only that history, but the fact that he's also had a history of being patient with the players he's trying to develop. And I think that's the most important thing about having patience with that position, the goaltending position. Having said that, a guy like Caden Gooley might still be there. Braden Schneider might be there. So you can address, either the right shot guy or the left shot guy. They're similar in terms of what they bring to the table, in that they're both really good skaters. They both play an old school, stay-at-home physical brand. And both of them, I do think, have some untapped potential offensive upside. So I think the possibilities are going to be really wide open. And Tony, I don't think you can close the door on a trade back scenario. When I look at the Oilers picking at 14 and then not again to the 4th round, maybe a trade back to get into that 30-some range, allows you to acquire an additional asset, a pick somewhere in the 2nd, maybe even early in the 3rd.
And that's exactly what Jack Michael said in our latest panel, our pre-draft panel, which queued up the 2020 NHL draft. But you're going with Askarov in your mock draft, despite the Oilers picking a handful of goalies in each of the last 5 drafts, Sam?
Well, I think the way you have to look at it is it's important to pick a lot of goalies and to have a lot of them. But I also think it's important to identify which of those guys is going to project out. And because it's so tough to make the determination on the position, are you sitting there and you're saying Stuart Skinner is going to be the guy? I think that in that meantime, those players have the option, obviously, to make that jump and push forward. But there's also the option of looking at the free agent market to fill that gap. Now, if, for example, a Stuart Skinner or one of the other goaltending prospects is able to make that jump and become the guy that you projected him to be when you took him, that allows you that additional asset to play with at a position that's really, really important with the player who's so highly thought of when it comes to Askarov. So again, if you're only looking at that one pick, it might be a little bit of a risky venture to do it there. Yeah. Having said that, this guy is a franchise guy. Is he that much more predictive to be the franchise guy than the people that are already there? That's probably the question you're asking yourself if you're Tyler Wright and Keith Gretzky and, of course, Ken Holland.
I definitely heard some rumblings around the 2020 NHL draft and saying that he's almost as highly as regarded as Carey Price was when he went fifth overall to the Montreal Canadiens. Is that a testament that you might share in terms of how high his ability can truly be for any team that drafts him?
Yeah, I think all the signs are pointing to that. I mean, his international resume is pretty much flawless. I think he's got 5 or 6 medals in the times that he's played internationally. His VHL record last year was outstanding. You know, people will harken back in the World Juniors because that's what a lot of people see. But I think that was a bit of an anomaly in terms of his year. And of course, his start to the KHL season has been really good as well. But he checks the size box for all NHL teams at 6'3". He's extremely athletic. He competes like a bugger. Some people question the glove hand a little bit, but I do think that that's something that you can improve upon. So when projecting this guy out, you know, I would say he does look like the next Andrei Vasilevsky. But again, only time is going to tell us that. And I think if I look at Ilya Samsonov, drafted by Washington in 2015, him just starting to make an impact last year with the Washington Capitals, that's probably the timeline you'd have to assume.
You mentioned his strong start to the KHL season. He currently has a 0.74 goals against average and a 974 save percentage in 3 starts, just absolutely raising his stock for sure. But shortly after the draft lottery, Sam, you published a mock draft on August 11th. But at that time, you had the Oilers taking Dawson Mercer at 14. We'll get to a few other players in just a few moments, but why Mercer at the time?
Well, I think Mercer's a really, really good player, and he's versatile. I think he can play center, he can play the wing. He's an energy guy. He can play with pace. He's good at the small area game. And when I look at the numbers he's produced here over the last couple of years, it's been pretty impressive. What I like about the player is the fact that he has drive. You know, 2 years ago as a 16-year-old with Drummondville, he scores 30 goals, but they were a really good team, and they were expected to go deep in the playoffs, and they were deep. And I think he was able to take advantage of some matchups playing more of in a second/third line role. He went back into the offseason last year and said, you know what, I want to prove to people that I can drive the bus and not just be a passenger on it. And so he asserted himself at the start of the year to the point where he earned himself an invitation to the Canada-Russia series in November. And I believe his play in those 2 games there earned him the invite to Canada's World Junior Camp. And I thought, wow, this is a pretty good feather in the cap for this guy. Turns out he ends up making the team, albeit in a limited role, but a role that he accepted, a role that I think will help him moving forward, and a role that tells me and verified to me that all that work he did in the offseason to prove that he's a driver of play and a driver of the bus as opposed to being the passenger turned out to be true.
Yeah, Mercer had 60 points in 42 games last season with duties split between Drummondville and Chicoutimi. He even got 2 goals in his first game this season, Sam, in Chicoutimi's season opener. All right, so as you know, we conducted our pre-draft panel this past weekend, and Jack Michaels and Bob Stauffer submitted their picks for the Oilers at 14, and both selected Seth Jarvis. Maybe give us some insight on Jarvis's game.
Yeah, a really good pick, and that's probably the exact range in which he's going to be in. But Seth Jarvis playing with the Portland Winterhawks, playing in that up-tempo style of game that has been a hallmark of what Mike Johnson has done when he's coached in the Western Hockey League. When it comes to Jarvis, he's a lot similar to Dawson Mercer in that small area game where he's got really good hands, but I like he's got some bite. He drives the net. He's a driver of play. And what's important to note is with his point production, just under 100 points with Portland, finishing second in the Western Hockey League this year, he was playing on a line mostly with the 03-born O'Brien, who we're going to be talking about this guy here next year. So when you look at that 17-year-old player being the driver of play on a line with at least one younger player, that says a lot to me. Oftentimes when you get these super skilled draft-eligible guys, they're flanked by players who are older, who are more experienced, who are already NHL draft picks. And so that takes some of the pressure off of the draft eligible player having to be the centerpiece of the line. For Jarvis, that wasn't the case whatsoever. And so him being the driver of a line that included at least one younger player says a lot to me about what it looks like for him going forward. But, good skater, really serious guy, high compete, high character, a lot of good things to like about Jarvis. So that is a very reasonable spot for Seth at 14 for sure.
Yeah, 98 points in 58 games in Johnson's high-octane offense there in Portland last year. But sticking with panel picks, Sam, I was the odd man out, and perhaps a little bit of wishful thinking on my part, but I went with Ottawa winger Jack Quinn. Is he the most pure finisher in the draft?
Well, his 52 goals would tell you that, and the 40-goal difference from the year before would definitely speak to that. But we do have a couple of really good shooters in this draft, be it Lucas Reichel, Alexander Holtz. Obviously, Quinn has that as a big part of his arsenal. I don't think he gets that far down the list. I think when I look at his year-over-year improvement and the growth potential that still exists with Jack in terms of growing physically, and the fact, Tony, that not only is he a right shot, right winger, but most people at the NHL level project that he'll be able to play center down the road. And I think that gives him additional value. And I think that pushes him up into a spot ahead of 14.
Well, other players mentioned in and around 14 were Alexander Holtz, as you just mentioned, Dylan Holloway, Anton Lundell. Sam, there are plenty of strong forwards and even defensemen that could really boost any team's organization in the first round here, isn't there?
Yeah, it's pretty awesome. I mean, at 14, I'd be ecstatic to have that pick for sure. I mean, I would feel super comfortable anywhere from 1 to 10. But then when you get into that next grouping of players, there's going to be a lot of options available there for Ken Holland to make that selection. So I'm fascinated to see what shakes down. Again, I do see the trade back scenario potentially presenting itself to acquire another asset. Anytime you come in as a general manager, you want to start building the team in your own mold, and the best way to do that is through the draft. So I think Ken Holland might be looking at that and saying, all right, let's get one more piece here. We really trust our staff, and we like the depth of this year's draft, and this might be the time to do it. I think the other thing I'd say about that is when I'm looking at this 2002 born draft class, despite not having the playoffs, Memorial Cup, and under 18s to draw on, we are probably still as a group going to know more about this group than we will the 2003 borns. So it's not like you want to sit back and say, all right, wait till next year when we have more picks. We're going to know a lot less about those players with the Hlinka Cup already being the Hlinka Gretzky Cup being canceled, the World Junior A Challenge having been canceled, and the uncertainty about the remainder of play in all leagues across the world.
Very interesting there. Something that personally I didn't even consider. So thank you for that, Sam. But in terms of overall strength of the 2020 draft class, is there any other draft class that this year's version reminds you of? Because to me, for some reason, it strikes a lot of similarities to the 2020 draft class. A lot of high-end forwards, some defensive great prospects, and one goaltender who really stands out heading in, that being Jack Campbell back in 2010.
Yeah, so that was an interesting group, no question. And again, it's always a little bit of that cautionary tale when drafting a goaltender in the first round. Use Campbell as the example, really, as a guy who came over to Toronto and started to play some meaningful minutes, but it's taken him a little while to get there. I mean, Jordan Binnington, you can say the same thing. The list goes on, although Binnington wasn't taken in the first round. But yeah, I do see some similarities to that, where you look at the depth of the forward position, in particular wingers. But I do think that the 2010 draft class had a lot more natural centers, whereas in this draft class, guys like Jarvis potentially, Jack Quinn potentially, and you're looking at these guys that might have the opportunity to move to the center ice position down the road where they're naturally listed as a winger. So I do think that possibility exists for a couple players in this draft where we saw more natural centers back in 2010.
As we already mentioned, 2020 has been so unusual, but on draft day for you, Sam, what's it going to look like for you?
Well, I'm pretty lucky to be working on a panel with Brian Burke. He's been such a great add to our network. Elliot Friedman, maybe the best insider in the game right now. Mike Fuda, the former assistant general manager with the LA Kings, is going to join us on our panel. And Jeff Merrick, who has such great zest and thirst and knowledge of the junior game and of the prospect pool. So lucky enough to be working with those guys. I think the way it's going to play out is that we'll go to Bill Daly in New York. They'll make the selection. I think they hope to have a camera in some of the prospects' homes so you can still kind of get that hug and kiss and the elation of the family for their son having been drafted. And then they'll throw it back to us, four boneheads, and see if we can talk about things in an appropriate manner.
I don't know about boneheads, but I said it before and I'll say it again. You're the draft guru, Sam. Thanks so much for doing this. It should be a fun couple of days ahead of us.
Yeah, Tony, my pleasure, and hope we get to do it live in person in Buffalo next year.
Can't wait, my friend.